How about now?
Now it's perfect.
Okay.
I was almost right with my prediction. Okay.
Okay, so hi, I'm Daphne. Thank you so much for Mark for inviting me to this workshop. I've been working on active inference for about a year now, and I found it to be quite an elaborate topic to wrap my head around at times. So I'm really grateful to be learning from the best. I'm going to be discussing a paper I wrote last year with Carl Friston and Thomas Parr. It's about the coming waves of emotional inference devices. The topic is quite broad, and it's just kind of a prospectus on the possibilities that could come out of combining research across disciplines. So I hope I don't bore you too much with things that you already know. But I'm going to talk through the current state of the art of emotional intelligence and how active inference can expand on those towards a model of emotions that is generative and adaptable to different contexts, and eventually shareable across the user and the device. This field really excites me because of its applications beyond industry, which is where emotional devices are mostly being used right now, towards a more rigorous foundation for psychiatry and understanding the brain. So by observing the world of machine learning right now, it seems like we're heading in a direction that integrates emotional inference into technology, whether that's with NLP and sentiment analysis, or computer vision and kind of detecting emotional patterns in the face. And all of this, of course, encompassed by deep learning and deep neural networks. These approaches are new and interesting, but they're still quite limited in their ability to properly quantify uncertainty, which is so intrinsic to the emotional mind and the mind in general, as well as because of their reliance on a lot of data and their difficulty in contextualizing that data. I think that the current deep learning and specifically variational techniques like autoencoders and GANs are really well described in a quote by Richard Feynman, which is, "What I cannot create, I do not understand," in the sense that they're limited by themselves and they're not really able to understand sensory input or output that they haven't been trained on. And this is quite contrary to the way that the human brain learns, because we're always encountering what we cannot create and learning our own interpretation of that. So that's kind of where this Bayesian brain hypothesis, free energy principle, and active inference comes in, which wants to combine the structure of deep learning with the fluidity of psychology. There's a lot going on in the field of human behavior right now outside of only machine learning and neuroscience, like genetics and personality analysis, which is considered maybe more soft, but it can also be really useful in making predictions. So here on the slides, I just put two things that I did recently that I found kind of interesting. The top is the result of a 23andMe genetics test, which was able to actually pick up on traits about fears based solely on DNA. And the bottom is the 16 personality test, which quantifies from a survey how you're likely to behave and perceive the world. So I think that if we expanded on fields like these in conjunction to neuroscience and machine learning, we would be able to bridge a gap between these disciplines and really create an encompassing way to model the mind. In essence, if we take as given that the human is a somewhat Bayesian being, then the idea would be to combine all of this research happening in different corners of cognitive fields, identify the data that it takes to make these kinds of predictions, and then take a probabilistic approach to combine them into a generative model of behavior and its causes and its consequences. So why would we actually want to do this? Well, currently psychology and mental health is really still dominated by cognitive behavioral therapy, which is an absolutely useful and fascinating field, but it somehow lacks rigor and replicability. So the question would become whether we can use emotion recognition models to gain insight into psychological conditions and how false inferences of emotional states can occur. This idea of understanding the model well enough to predict and understand the false inferences and the errors that the brain as a predictive machine makes is really crucial to gain insight into phobias and into conditions like anorexia or schizophrenia, and any condition in which the person is misaligning their internal models with the external reality. So the goal would be to construct a scientific and rigorous method for psychiatry that goes beyond or combines with cognitive behavioral therapy and can actually predict the source of the false perception and understand how to change the mind to allow it to see reality, or at least to escape the cognitive and behavioral patterns that isolate a person from themselves and the world. And so why active inference? Well, active inference has become really popularized recently because of its ecological and neurobiological validity in terms of predicting behavior and hidden internal states of the individual brain, as well as the hidden states of groups of brains or societies. So I'd be really happy to go into more specifics and technicalities of active inference later if people are interested, because I'm learning a lot about it myself in the past few months, and I'm starting to make my own models. But essentially, it's just a variational technique which is able to not only infer the most probable state, and most probable means most rewarding in this context, the most probable state of the world given variables that define a perspective, but also it can infer the most probable and therefore rewarding action. And through this inference of actions, the model can infer how actions form a reaction, a new state, and a new action. So in terms of emotional inference, we can imagine these states to be emotional states, whatever emotion one is experiencing in the moment, and the action being whatever it is that one uses to express that emotion or to gauge the emotion of another. So the minute your brain performs an emotional inference, it'll set you up for an action, which then feeds back into a reaction and updated emotional state. And then these emotional states get ingrained somehow and inform your memory and your model of the world. So over time, active inference can suggest how humans form habits and longstanding beliefs, and is crucial when trying to understand the development of emotion and expectations throughout life. So the whole generative process that goes on in your mind, which we may be able to one day mimic in computers, essentially creates a personal model of the world from childhood, when the brain is malleable and everything is still unexpected, to adulthood when plasticity weakens and beliefs are less easily changed. And with regards to psychiatry, this can serve to explain developed emotional impairments, in which experiences such as traumas can skew this generative model and lead to prediction errors and therefore a false perception of reality. So the hypothesis of our paper is that emotion recognition and inference devices will evolve from the current state-of-the-art deep learning models into active inference schemes that go beyond marketing applications and become adjunct to psychiatric practice. The current wave of emotion recognition devices is supervised deep learning, which is a bottom-up approach which learns how to predict from facial expressions or language what labeled emotions these features represent. While this is limited, it is still useful because it's about learning a baseline emotional lexicon that can then be used to equip the next wave of devices. In the second wave, a Bayesian approach can be taken that allows these devices to firstly take into account contextual information, and secondly, resolve uncertainty about emotional states by actively eliciting responses from the user and then learning from those responses. So this would require a way of gauging emotional states. So the device would need eyes or a face or some way of expressing signals to the user. And then eventually in the third wave, the idea would be to make devices that are themselves emotional, so that the device and the user can converge on a shared generative model, resulting in a reciprocal and pro-social emotional interaction. But before diving into the waves, I'll talk briefly about what it would take to accomplish this in terms of the model itself. So according to the free energy principle, to be alive is to obtain the best possible model of the world given limitations of biological ability. And then to continue to be alive and to learn is to continuously improve this model. And this is what active inference describes. This optimization is the same as minimizing expected free energy or uncertainty or surprise. On the one part, we create predictions. So that's kind of the bottom-up recognition density, which are informed estimates of what we expect to happen in the world, which happens all of the time. When we get up in the morning, we plan our days, we have conversations with others. We're always kind of making predictions or expecting what we think will happen. And at the same time, sometimes unexpected things are going to happen, especially when we're children and we're encountering everything for the first time, which makes us update our internal models of reality. And then when we choose our behavior and our actions, we do so in order to confirm our expectations. But we also do so subjectively based on our expectations. And this continuous phenomenon creates our own subjective realities over our lifetimes. And this has been really well described and illustrated with a Markov blanket. Markov blanket is just a mathematical conditional independence between internal states and external states, which can only be mediated and accessed through blanket states. And so when used to describe emotional inference or the mind inferring in general, the internal states can be the brain, and the external states is everything but the brain. It could be, for example, the states of the person that one is engaging with. And then action and sensation correspond to the expressions and interactions between the two people, which are their only way of getting closer to a true representation of each other's emotional states. So for example, if I'm speaking to you, I'll predict how you should behave and then confirm my predictions by the way that your behavior differs from my expectations. Thereby, I'll be using me and my emotions to build my model of you and your emotions. And the cool thing about Markov blankets is that they allow for multiple levels of inference. For example, the individual level of the brain is one level, which can then be combined to form the societal and cultural level. And that can also be an internal state where the external state is everything except for that society. And both those levels are really important for understanding emotional inference, as our predictions of emotion really depend on our view of ourselves, of each other, and of our society as a whole. So essentially what this means in this context is that we all essentially have two separate models. So you're going to have a model of how you think people in general behave, and then you're going to have a model of all the people that you actually know and how you think that they behave specifically. And if you're speaking to someone that you know and they start behaving out of your model of how you think they should behave, you'll already be able to recognize that uncertainty or that kind of something is off, even if they're still behaving in line with how you think in general people should behave. And that's just kind of like a conceptual way of understanding these like two different hierarchical models in terms of human behavior. Yeah, and this also relates to work I've been doing more recently in multi-agent active inference, where we're modeling social networks and echo chambers. So we're trying to show the effect of people isolating themselves in social platforms such that they only have access to information that confirms their expectations and their beliefs. And this is strongly related to emotional inference on a cultural level, because it can create an effect of strong emotion when a person in an echo chamber confronts differing beliefs from their own or from those that they're expecting and used to seeing. And this is a really interesting and relevant phenomenon that can be modeled. But if we just reflect on everything that I've said so far, it seems like the theory is telling us that at all points in our lives, we as humans or biological agents in general are just choosing to believe and to behave in a way that brings us closer to the true reality. But if we are continuously exacting our internal model of the external world, then the question becomes, why do we behave so counterintuitively? Because it seems that if we were to build a generative model and just tell it to minimize the difference between its internal states and its external states through its sensation, then you wouldn't expect it to behave like humans do, because it seems that there's another drive which feeds into optimizing this cost function, which dominates behavior and can lead to seemingly impulsive, irrational, and sometimes even self-destructive behavior. And this missing piece in the model that we've described so far is the effect of emotion itself. So emotion has the interesting property that it catalyzes human experience and learning. When learning something unemotional, it can take a lot of repetition and memorization in order to know and to not forget it, and therefore to update our internal model with that new information. And this is just like studying something that you're not interested in, for example. So on the screen, you can think of the plot as kind of on the x-axis, mutually exclusive ideas, and on the y-axis, probabilistic beliefs, such that updating the probability of one idea necessarily decreases the probability of the opposing ideas. And so through reinforcement and learning, this distribution will get more peaked around whatever it is that you are learning. But when emotion is involved, it'll completely change the way that we learn and remember. And a stronger emotion will have a much stronger effect on how quickly and powerfully we will learn from an experience. And that can be thought of as a catalyst that makes that distribution peaked much faster and without the need for repetition. And I'm sure that other people presenting in this conference will have a more scientific way of describing that, but that's kind of a broad description. And this can begin to explain why we are all so different and behave in a way that would not necessarily follow just the principle of converging to the true reality, because we are dominated by our emotions and they create our beliefs of the world much stronger than anything else. So now I'm just going to go through the different waves that we describe in the paper of emotional inference. So starting with deep supervised learning, essentially there have been successful simulations that get a decent degree of accuracy by just getting a lot of training data, which is labeled with different emotions, and it's just pictures. and then just understanding the distribution of pixel intensities in that image, and then learning from the training data what that distribution of pixels, which emotion it represents, which label it represents, such that then when it gets new unlabeled data, it's able to quite consistently predict the correct emotion that's being represented in that picture that doesn't have a label. So these existing methods can be useful in certain contexts when you have a lot of really clean data and you're not trying to compare really different things to really different contexts. And they can form a foundation of how to read emotions. But they are really limited because they don't consider contextual differences. And the devices that perform these inferences are not able to interact with the user or elicit responses from the user to resolve uncertainty. So that kind of suggests the need for a more deep and hierarchical model, because this limitation motivates the need. It motivates the need for a deep and hierarchical model, because not only does each person have an internal model, but also each niche in each culture which a person belongs to has an internal model. And that is representing what it means to express certain emotions and what it looks like and sounds like and how to understand others within and not within that group. So in order to correctly infer these emotions across people, one needs to be able to understand both this cultural model as well as the individual model. And the example on the slides is just showing that it's obvious that two different people might display the emotion of fear quite differently. For example, a child home alone versus a psychopath Charles Manson, a psychopath might display fear quite differently between each other. And you would need to know the context in order to really predict what emotion is being displayed in that image. So it's really important, to take the context into account to correctly infer emotional states. And that's one thing that active inference is able to do by having kind of these prior preferences and this contextual information and these Markov blankets on different levels of the individual and their society, and each of those having their own priors. But also, active inference is active. And so that means that it can have features that are able to elicit responses from users. So in the second wave, devices need to be kind of humanoid in the sense that they require a visual representation of a face with which the device can perform actions and observe how the user responds. So on the screen is the robot iCub performing active inference to resolve uncertainty when reaching for objects, which is the first step towards applying active inference on humanoid machines. The eliciting of responses is crucial because if the inference device is uncertain about which emotional state the user is in, then free energy minimization will enable it to display the expression that will resolve the most of this uncertainty, given the lexica of emotional states that the device is equipped with. And that's something that can be brought from the deep learning kind of lexicon that we're building today. This eliciting of responses is something we humans do all of the time when we're gauging each other's emotional states. If you just consider how much a slight eye roll or a twitch of the head can communicate from one individual to another. So if one cannot perform these actions, then one cannot learn how the user will react to an action. And so it's really an essential component of inference within emotional interactions. And finally, in the third wave, the idea would be that the user will be able to engage in emotional exchanges, meaning that the user's generative model will also begin to predict the artifact's behavior or the device's behavior. So not only will the device be predicting whatever the person is feeling, but also the person will be predicting what the device is feeling or displaying, or whatever emotional state or internal state is being encoded in the device at that moment. And this conceptual leap defines the difference between an emotionally intelligent device in wave 2 and an emotional device in wave 3. So this form of an artificial emotional companion can only be achieved once the circle is closed between human and machine, meaning that not only does the machine actively infer emotions from the human, but the human actively infers emotions from the machine as well. Therefore, it would be necessary for the artifact to produce kind of signals and learn from the emotional lexicon through a human agent. So the device will essentially be able to model the human so well that it will be able to converge its own active inference generative model onto its user's generative model and essentially predict what the user is predicting, as well as be able to communicate that such that the user can predict what the device is generating. And this is really where the widest of applications can come in. Because if one can use a device to converge to the generative model of a person with some anomaly in predictions, such as paranoia, for example, then the device will be able to understand how these predictions are generated and what they consist of in some sense, and also what kind of sensation might alleviate them in a way that cognitive behavioral therapy can only guess at today. Of course, this is a long way away, but as we learn more about the human brain and the emotions and become better at modeling them, it is a real possibility that we can approach this kind of convergence. And that is all of my slides. I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you so much for listening. And if there aren't any questions, I prepared a couple of discussion points I would also be able to go through, which is just on active inference, because I've been doing so much active inference. So yeah, thank you so much.